Namaste, hello, and a very warm welcome to UPSC for everyone. My name is Abhinav, and in this video, we are going to discuss selected topics from the Hindu and Indian Express. We'll be discussing the following topics: massive Chinese buildup on north bank of Pangong Lake. Here we will understand the concept of finger points. What are finger points? You must have heard about finger points and read about them. So today I'll tell you all about finger points and what the actual situation is right now at the LAC. The second item that we'll discuss is redefining a farmer. Now there's a scheme called PM Kisan. So we'll get to know about PM Kisan, and recently a scam of rupees 110 crore has been unearthed in this scheme in Tamil Nadu. So that is why this issue is in news. Next, we'll discuss a report by Confederacy of Indian Industries, CII, that says that travel and tourism may lose 5 lakh crore due to this COVID lockdown. But this is the worst case scenario. We'll also get a brief overview of the tourism industry in India. Then a very important topic: in blockchain voting, leave out general election. So basically, Election Commission of India is trying to incorporate more technology into the election process, and it is exploring the idea of implementing blockchain technology to enable voting in the elections. So we'll understand first what is blockchain technology, then we'll understand whether it should be implemented for elections or not. And then last is the report by World Wildlife Federation that says that wildlife population has gone down by 68% since 1970. So not a very good news for biodiversity and our planet. So let's get started. Massive Chinese buildup on north bank of Pangong Lake. The PLA has occupied ridge lines and it has amassed troops on the north bank of fingers 4 to 8. Now let us first understand what are fingers. Now this is related to the Pangong Tso Lake. This is the Pangong Tso Lake. So if you look at this lake from a satellite, the spurs of these mountain ranges, they are called Chang Chenmo, and they lie on the northern banks of the lake. They look like fingers, so they are called finger points. And at the Pangong Tso, the LAC is demarcated in terms of the finger points, and 2/3 of Pangong Tso lies in China and 1/3 in India. Okay, so basically India says that LAC is up till finger 8, but physically we had control till finger 4, but we would patrol from finger 4 to finger 8, right? But in April what happened, that China stopped us. This area is basically called gray area between fingers 4 and 8. So now China is occupying this region and it is stopping our troops from carrying out patrols. Now the basic problem is at the LAC that there is difference of perception. We say that LAC is up till finger point 8. China initially said finger point 4. Now they are saying 2. So, and probably one day they'll say the entire India belongs to them. So you really can't trust the Chinese. So now these finger points, they run from west to east and they are numbered 1 to 8. And they lie on the northern banks of the lake and they are part of a mountain called Chang Chenmo. Now India claims, I've already told you that LAC is coterminous with finger 8, but it physically controls an area only up to finger 4. But it could patrol up to finger 8. But now the Chinese troops are present between fingers 4 and 8, which is called the gray area. Okay. And they are stopping Indian troops from patrolling up till finger 8, and they are effectively trying to alter the status quo. Now China has, as has been reported in the media, that China has ingressed about 8 kilometers in the finger area of the North Bank. But now the game is changing, because in the area south of the lake, Indian Army has dominated ridges and hills in the Chushul area. In the previous video, I have explained what all heights we have occupied, right? So you can refer to that video and you will understand. And I've also told you the importance about Chushul area earlier. Chushul area is from where our assessments say that if any incursion has to happen, it will happen from the Chushul area. Even in the 1962 war, the incursion happened from the Chushul area only. Now, Chinese state media reports that Chinese bombers, air defense troops, artillery, armored vehicles, etc. have been mobilized to the area. So China is trying to bully us, but now that we have controlled the south part of the lake, which is the more strategic part, now we are at the heights, elevations, and from those points we can actually get the bird's view of the entire area, and we can thwart any Chinese attempts for incursions. And this has rattled China. See, the problem is that along the LAC, the natural topography of the region up till now favored China. It is more gentle in the Chinese region, but for our area, it is more rugged. And when the whole issue started in April, our approach was somewhat conservative. Now we are taking a more aggressive stand and we are challenging China. And now it seems that China may be ready to talk, but then again, we really can't trust the Chinese. I've already made a video about the whole China incursion thing. I'll provide a link in the description. You can go and watch that video to have a better understanding. I've also explained what is the LAC, the whole history of LAC, how it came to be, what all agreements we have signed. Redefining a farmer. Now, farmers are the backbone of our country, along with the people who serve in the armed forces. Now, unfortunately, in our country, the farmers don't really get their due. There are a lot of problems that plague the farmers. So governments have come up with various schemes to cater to the farmers, to provide them sops of different kinds. So there's a scheme called PM Kisan, which was launched last year, and it is basically an income support scheme for the farmers, and it provides a support of 6,000 rupees per annum in 3 equal installments to the accounts of the beneficiary. Now it has come to light that there has been a scam of rupees 110 crore in Tamil Nadu, and that has put the spotlight on the definition of a farmer. Why? Because as per this scheme, a farmer is a land holding person, and identification of beneficiary was in the hands of the state and UT administration. So the officials of the state government, they connived with the people, and they forged their identities as being farmers, and they swindled money out of government accounts. And the problem is that the real beneficiaries, the real intended beneficiaries, who are poor farmers who work very hard, they don't get any kind of support. First, let us know something about the PM Kisan Yojana. Now this scheme is known as the Pradhan Mantri Kisan Samman Nidhi, or PM Kisan. It is a central sector scheme, meaning that it is 100% funding from the government of India. And it is implemented by Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. These days UPSC is also asking which scheme is implemented by which ministry, and students are confused as to which schemes to follow. So your best bet would be to pay attention to the schemes that are in news. So for example, now this PM Kisan scheme is in news, and which ministry implements it? Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. Now under this scheme, the center transfer an amount of 6,000 rupees per year in 3 equal installments, I've already told you, directly into the bank accounts of all the land holding farmers. Now here is the problem. Land holding farmers. Now there are many landless farmers who lease the land, they do all the work, they are the ones who actually till the land. But unfortunately, they don't get access to any of the government SOPs. Like they don't get subsidized electricity, they don't get subsidized fertilizers or seeds, and they don't even have the access to farm credit. And these are the people who fall prey to money lenders. And according to the NCRB reports, these tenant farmers, as they are known, which are basically taking land on lease, they are the majority of farmers who unfortunately commit suicide in our country. Now, this scheme is intended to supplement the financial needs of small and marginal farmers. So there are different schemes regarding small and marginal farmers. Now, it is intended to just supplement their income, because what happens at the end of the farming season, they don't have any money, right? And when they are raising a crop, they are not having any access to income. They get income only after their crop is fully grown and it is sold off, and sometimes they don't get that money that quickly. So, but their activities don't stop, especially activities related to procuring seeds and other materials. So this scheme is intended to help in that anticipated farm income at the end of each crop cycle, right? Now, the entire responsibility of the identification of beneficiaries is with the state and UT governments, and there the problem lies, that there was a connivance between officials and unscrupulous figures who swindled government money. Now, why do we need to redefine? Now, formal definition is necessary so that we can identify the potential beneficiaries of government schemes. Now, there has to be clarity as to who is a farmer so that these ambiguities cannot be exploited by any official or any person. Now, what are the problems? Improper definition leads to ambiguity as to who can avail the government SOPs. There can be collusion, that I've told you, and beneficiaries, the real intended beneficiaries, can be cheated. The problem is that land ownership is mandatory to be identified as a farmer in many states, and categories like tenant farmers are excluded. And basically these are the farmers who really are small and marginal farmers. Now, how is a farmer defined? There are multiple definitions in official data published by Government of India. There's one in the population census which defines cultivators as persons engaged in cultivation of land, either owned or held in kind or share. Then there's a 59th round of situation assessment survey of farmers, or the SAS survey, which was conducted by NSSO. I told you in the previous video that now there is only one organization called NSO, which is the combination of both NSSO and CSO, right? Now, this 59th round of SAS also stressed on possession of land, either owned or leased or otherwise. So possession of land is very, very important in every definition. Then the 70th round of SAS, it delinked land in defining criterion for a farmer. So this is a better definition for a farmer. Here the agricultural households were defined as those receiving some value of produce from agricultural activities during the previous 365 days. So that means that you are getting some amount of money from agricultural activities in the previous year, then you will be described as an agricultural household. And they have also prescribed a minimum cutoff value of rupees 3,000, that at least this much of income you should be getting from farm activities in the last 365 days to be counted as a farmer. Now, there was another policy called the National Policy of Farmers 2007, which adopted the broad-based definition, and it was independent of land ownership as well as value of produce. So you can see that there's a plethora of definitions, and that really leads to ambiguity, and that ambiguity is like a chink in the armor which can be exploited. So what government really needs is to come with a homogeneous definition. But then again, there's a problem that that definition can be used in central schemes, right? Now, problem is the government of India can make a scheme, but implementation is done mostly by the state governments. because they are the ones who are at the cutting edge. They know the ground realities, right? And secondly, agriculture is a state subject. So government really can't tell the states as to what to do with agriculture. Government can make model laws and it is up to states whether they agree to it or not. Now in all this confusion of a definition, the real sufferers are the tenant farmers. According to 2015-16 agricultural census, around 2.65 million operational holdings are either partially or wholly leased, right? For example, you own a piece of land. Now you lease that land to someone else, but you are the one who will be getting the government SOPs and not this person. The impact of agrarian distress is felt disproportionately by the tenant farmer. The tenant farmer incurs the cost, including rental payments, and faces the risks, while the owner receives the rent, subsidies, and other support. The leasees do not benefit from loan waivers, moratorium, and institutional credit, and are forced to be at mercy of money lenders. So we really need to have a homogeneous definition of who is a farmer so that there are no ambiguities. Now in this article, in blockchain voting, leave out the general election, we will be discussing about blockchain technology and also the potential benefits and the disadvantages of implementing blockchain for voting. So the Election Commission of India is exploring the idea of further digitizing the election infrastructure of the country on the backbone of blockchain. So first, let us understand what is blockchain. Now, blockchain is a system of recording information in a way that makes it difficult or impossible to change, hack, or cheat the system. Now, it is a very interesting concept, and I'll tell you how it is very difficult to change, hack, or cheat the system. But it is difficult, not impossible. Nothing is foolproof. So it is essentially a digital ledger. If you're not familiar with commerce, ledger is basically a record keeping book or an account keeping book. So it is a digital ledger. Each transaction that takes place is recorded with a unique timestamp and a unique digital signature in the form of a hash. And that signature is cryptographic signature. So that cryptographic signature cannot be hacked. Okay. For example, when you use WhatsApp, you must have gotten the message that this chat is end-to-end encrypted and it is secure. Encryption is basically a method of securing digital communication. There's a concept of digital key. For example, if I send you a message from person A to person B, I send you a message. So it has a unique key, and only the person who is intended to receive this message has the decryption key to unlock this message. So this is how the cryptography works. A very basic and working definition. Of course, there are a lot of technicalities in it. I've just given you a basic idea about cryptography. So blockchain is essentially a digital ledger where transaction is duplicated and distributed across the entire network. For example, this is the network and these are the nodes. Nodes mean users like you and me. So if anyone makes a transaction, it is duplicated and sent to everyone. And that is a unique transaction. Now, if, for example, if a hacker wants to make a change, he will not be, because he can make change at one node only, but all the other nodes would be having a different information and that will be immediately detected. This is the principle of blockchain. This is basically known as the distributed ledger technology, where there is a decentralized database which is maintained by all participants or multiple participants. So each block in the chain contains a number of transactions, and every time a new transaction occurs, a record of the transaction is added to every participant's ledger, like I explained it. Okay. The decentralized database is managed by multiple participants and it is known as the distributed ledger technology, or the DLT. So blockchain is basically a type of DLT in which transactions are recorded with an immutable cryptographic signature called hash. I just told you that there is a cryptographic signature, and I've also given you a working definition of how cryptography works. Now, this is what a distributed ledger technology looks like, which is the backbone of blockchain. These are the characteristics of a DLT. Number one, it is programmable. That means a blockchain is programmable so that the participants can program it and make it. For example, I want to make a blockchain for cryptocurrency. Basically, blockchain technology became famous with the use of cryptocurrency only. Second is that it is secure. That is, all records are individually encrypted. Again, the concept of end-to-end encryption. Only the person who's intended to get the information will get the information. It is anonymous. That means the identity of the participants is not revealed, right? It is unanimous, that all network participants agree to the validity of each of the records. And this is how we check against any hacking activity or unnecessary disturbance to the system. Then it is time-stamped. That means a transaction is time-stamped and it is recorded on each block. That means whenever there is a transaction, along with the data, this time is also there. Then it is immutable. That means any validated records are irreversible and cannot be changed. For example, you make a transaction at 12:01, so it is time-stamped. You cannot change it. And this again provides security. And it is distributed. That means all network participants have a copy of the ledger for complete transparency. So again, if there's a discrepancy at any end, it can be easily checked. For example, A, B, C, D are the participants. A hacker hacks system A, so there would be a discrepancy in the ledger, but B, C and D would automatically detect it because their ledgers are not matching. Again, concept of time stamping, that whenever the transaction took place, it should have been in every ledger. So if there's a discrepancy, that means there is a problem and that will be detected. So with the use of the cryptographic signature called hash, if one block in the chain is changed, it would be immediately apparent that it has been tampered with. Because everybody shares it, it is time stamped and it is distributed. So if any block is changed, it will be easily detected. So if hackers want to corrupt a blockchain system, they would have to change every block in the chain. For example, there is a DLT having C, D, E, F, G. These many participants, so they can hack 1, 2 or 3. So if they have to make any changes which are not detected, then they'll have to hack all the nodes simultaneously. Changes would have to be exactly at the same time because of the concept of time stamping. Now, if there are 10 participants, 20 participants, it would be easier. But imagine if there are millions of participants, then making such a change would be a Herculean task. And again, all the members are anonymous, so the hackers won't really get to know. Even if they hack 1 or 2 or 3 nodes, they can't possibly know the identity of each and every participant in the DLT. So this again provides the security to the system. Now the blocks on the blockchain are made up of digital pieces of information, and specifically they have 3 parts. They store information about transactions like date, time and amount. Okay. Number 2, they store information about who is participating in the transaction. So first of all, they will store the information about the transaction itself, and number 2, they will store the information about the participant in the transaction. And number 3, the blocks store information that distinguishes them from other blocks. So it's a 3-step process. For example, you make any transaction on any e-commerce site. So first it will make a record of the transaction, the date you made the transaction, the time stamping and the amount you spent on it. then it will have information of the participant, but it won't have your personal information. It will have a digital cryptographic signature, and from this signature you cannot be traced. Then it will have a unique hash signature that will be processed, and this signature will distinguish it from all the other blocks. Now, how the blockchain works? When a block stores new data, it is added to the blockchain. Blockchain, as its name suggests, consists of multiple blocks strung together. So just imagine like a chain. So there is a block in the chain, and each time a new transaction takes place, a new block is added, and every block is unique, having 3 types of information. Now, in order for a block to be added to the blockchain, 4 things must happen. So to be added to the blockchain, 4 things are necessary. Number 1, transaction must occur. Transaction can be your e-commerce transaction, or in this case, voting. Then that transaction must be verified. It must be verified throughout the system through the concept of timestamping. Then that transaction must be stored in the block, and that block must be given a hash, that is the cryptographic signature. Once hashed, the block can be added to the blockchain. And when a new block is added to the blockchain, it becomes publicly available to anyone to view. So anybody who's a part of the DLT or the network will be able to view that block. So this is about blockchain technology. Simply, what is a blockchain? It is a data chain consisting of what are known as blocks. It is basically based on the principle of distributed ledger technology, and blockchain is basically a digital ledger. So each time you make a transaction, a unique block is generated that is added to the chain. Now, whenever any block is added to the chain, it is copied to each and every user of the network, and it is time stamped. So if any change has to be made, it has to be made simultaneously at all the user ends. But since the users are anonymous and there are so many number of users, it is next to impossible to hack this system. I'm saying next to impossible because nothing is 100% safe. Now, what are the advantages of using blockchains for voting? So number 1, they will give benefit to internal migrants because you have to go to your constituency to vote. But with the use of blockchain technology, you can vote from any place. According to the census 2011, they roughly consist of 51 million population. So that is a very big population, and our country is known as a festival of democracy. Every month there is an election somewhere. So the use of blockchains would remove this problem. Number 2, useful for some remotely stationed members of the Indian Armed Forces. Right now they use the postal ballot, so this will help them. It can also enable Indians living abroad to participate in elections. So till now what happens, NRIs, they basically either they have to come down to India to cast their vote, or they basically nominate someone to cast their vote, and each person can nominate one unique person. It will also help in avoiding risks like voting during public health emergencies or other emergencies. For example, there are riots, or for example, amid this corona pandemic, how many people would really be willing to vote? We'll get to know soon in the Bihar elections. Now, what are the key issues of concern? Number 1 is your data security and the network security. And number 2, the system that the ECI is developing, it would still need people to go to a designated place. So going to a designated place basically beats the purpose. So electors would still have to physically reach a designated venue in order to cast their votes. The system would use whitelisted IP devices on dedicated internet lines, and that the system would make use of the biometric attributes for electors. So for example, you are an elector, so they'll probably use your Aadhaar details, or you'll give your thumb impression and they'll verify using your Aadhaar details. And there will be a dedicated internet line for this. Now, what are the problems? Number 1, authentication problems. For example, there are a lot of people whose Aadhaar cards are not there, or the network may be down. There might be long delay in authentication. So the issue is that more the digitization and interconnectivity, more the moving parts in the machine, greater the chance of failure. So this same principle applies here as well. Now these digitized system may also stand to exclude and disenfranchise certain individuals. Like we saw in the Aadhaar case, that certain people could not give their biometrics like their thumb impressions. Certain people did not want to part with their biometrics. So what about those people? There might be some network flaw or flaw in the design. So those issues have to be worked out. And while the provisioning of dedicated line may make the infrastructure less prone to outages, it may make it increasingly prone to targeted denial of service DOS attacks. So if I'm a hacker, I know that this line is being used for voting. So I will ping it so many times that other users won't be able to access this line. So this is about blockchain technology and the proposal to implement blockchain in elections. So let's see what happens. If these problems are worked out, then probably it can be a good solution for our country. Travel and tourism may lose 5 lakh crore study. Now these are the worst case scenarios, so we should not be that alarmed. But like they say, prepare for the worst case scenario and hope for the best. So it is based on a study conducted by CII, Confederation of Indian Industry, and hospitality consulting firm Hotelivate. Now it says that organized sector alone is likely to lose around $25 billion. So a whopping 40 billion around we would be losing in the unorganized sector. Now tourism industry is very important. These figures are only for the formal sector, that it accounts for 9.2% of India's GDP. So almost 10% of India's GDP is coming from tourism sector and employs 8% of the population, and total foreign exchange contribution of around $28 billion. That is the role of tourism in India. But this is based on the formal sector. A large part of tourism is in the informal sector, and tourism is one of the highest providers of employment in the country because it has a multiplying effect. For example, if there is a tourism spot, it supports a whole local economy. There would be tour guides, there would be cabs, rickshaws, dhabas, restaurants, services of different kinds, hotels. So tourism is very, very important. But unfortunately, this sector has been hit really bad because of the pandemic. And even though government has relaxed the conditions for lockdowns and now we are in unlock 4.0, but there's a sense of fear in people who are not ready to really travel. And it is both domestic and international. Now the tourists from abroad won't be that ready to come, and even if they come, then they have to follow quarantine and whatnot, and the situation is not exactly under control. As a matter of fact, because of complacency among the people, India is now, I think, the second highest case of corona in the world. But fortunately for us, the mortality rate is still down. So let's see what happens for the tourism industry. Now, very, very important news. World's wildlife population down by 68% since 1970. This is according to World Wildlife Federation's Living Planet Report 2020. So this report says that between 1970 and 2016, there has been a 68% reduction in global wildlife population. So it has not taken into account 2017, 18, 19 and 20. And those 4 years have been bad for the wildlife, especially growing deforestation and frequent forest fires from Australia to Brazil. Now it says that 75% of Earth's ice-free land surface has already been significantly altered, and it blames land use change as the major factor that is leading to decline in global wildlife population. Most of the oceans are polluted, we know, and there's a new kind of pollution called the microplastics. And more than 85% of area of wetlands has been lost during this period. So wetlands are very, very important, and in video 1 I covered about wetlands and the Pantanal wetland, which is the largest wetland in the world. It is in Brazil and it is also burning. Now, reasons for the biodiversity loss according to this report. The most important direct driver of biodiversity loss has been land use change. I already told you that. Primarily the conversion of pristine habitats into agricultural systems. So what really happens when you convert these habitats into agricultural systems? It, number one, destroys the habitats of the wild animals. It disturbs the ecological balance. It disturbs the food chain, and it increases man-animal conflict. See, whenever we talk about man-animal conflict, it is not because animals are getting into our territory. It is because we humans are getting into the territory of animals. Our greed for land and ever-growing population is forcing us to clear more and more forests and claim pristine habitats for the purpose of agriculture. And this is bringing us in direct conflict with animals. And it is also leading to loss in their population. It also says that much of the oceans have been overfished. That is leading to species over exploitation. So again, what happens, for example, if a species can reproduce itself, say in 2 months, but because of overfishing, they are not able to regenerate themselves or reproduce themselves, or what we call replace themselves, then what really happens that their numbers start dwindling. And eventually what happens that their population starts disappearing. Now there's also threat of invasive species and diseases. Now what are invasive species? Invasive species are the species that are not endemic to a particular region and they are brought from outside. And when that happens, they bring with themselves a lot of diseases. There's also problem of pollution and climate change. Now the largest wildlife population loss has been in the Latin American region at an alarming rate of 94%. And if we take into account the forest fires in Brazil, since President Bolsonaro took over, then this figure would be higher, I'm sure. And this is according to Living Planet Index. You should know the names of such indexes and reports. So this is what Living Planet Index. This is also released by the WWF. And surprisingly, one of the most threatened biodiversity globally has been freshwater biodiversity, which has been declining faster than that in oceans or forests. Now, India is known as a mega diverse country because only in 2.4% of world's land area, India has 45,000 species of plants. So it is called a mega diverse country. But it has already lost 6 plant species to extinction according to IUCN Red List. Now IUCN Red List, basically it gives 9 categories of threat to plant and animal species. We'll discuss that in some other video. What is IUCN? For now, you should know that IUCN gives a grading of threat to plant or animal species, and it is a 9-grade scale. The report further finds that India has lost nearly 1/3 of its natural wetlands to urbanization, agricultural expansion, and pollution over the last 4 decades. I've already discussed wetlands in video 2, so you can go and watch that video. Now, WWF India's report on water stewardship for industries revealed that 14 out of 20 river basins in India are already water stressed and will be moving to extreme water scarcity by 2050. So this is also very threatening news. We need to conserve water. Water conservation is very, very important, and India has a rich tradition of water conservation. There are various methods of water conservation from different states. Perhaps in some other video we will discuss that. Court stays Maratha quota. Now this issue of reservations is also in news lately. First of all, recently in August there was a judgment by the Supreme Court that said that states can have subgroups among SC and STs. Now these reservations are provided under Article 15 and 16 in the Constitution for education and under state employment. Now there are some exceptions. For example, in education, these principles don't apply to the minority run institutions. Now the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are defined under Article 341 and 342 of the Constitution, and it is the president who can add or subtract names from a list. Now the August judgment was given by a 5-judge bench, and it basically clashed with a 2004 Chinnaiya judgment, which was also given by a 5-judge bench. So now a higher judge bench will decide, and if it stays it, that means that there could be a criteria similar to creamy layer in SC/ST quota as well. Now this article basically deals with Maratha. Now in Maharashtra, a law was made to give Maratha community 12 to 13% quota. Now the Maratha community historically was land holding warrior community, but with time they have lagged in the socio-economic criteria, though they are the majority community politically in Maharashtra. So the politics of Maharashtra basically based on Maratha community. Now looking at their lagging socio-economic parameters, the government decided to provide quota for them. But a petition was filed against this quota in the Supreme Court on the grounds that number one, it breaches the 50% cap that was declared by Supreme Court in 1992. That judgment is known as the Indira Sawhney judgment. In that judgment, Supreme Court gave certain principles. It upheld the SC and ST reservation, but in that judgment it said that there cannot be any economic criteria for reservation. So number one objection is that it violates the 50% cap. Though Supreme Court has said that under extraordinary circumstances we can relax that cap. For example, in case of Tamil Nadu, where reservation is about 69%. Then they also say that this law also overstepped the constitutional limitations contained in the 102nd Amendment to the Constitution. Now this amendment said that the reservation can be granted only if particular community is named in the presidential list. So unless president does not name that community, it cannot be added. So they have said two grounds. Number one, violation of the Indira Sawhney judgment, that is 50% cap, and number two, they have also violated 102nd Amendment to the Constitution. Now if we talk about reservation in Maharashtra, following a 2001 State Reservation Act, the total reservation was 52%. With the addition of 12 to 13% Maratha quota, it went up to 64 to 65%, plus the 10% EWS economically weaker sections reservation by center is also effective. The reservation is running in a high limit. Now this case has been referred to a constitutional bench by the Supreme Court. Now what is a constitutional bench? Constitutional bench is a bench comprising of 5 judges or more. Okay, so minimum can be 5 and maximum can be full strength. At present the full strength of Supreme Court is 34 judges, and generally the constitutional benches are odd numbered. so that even if there is dissent, there can be a solution. And whenever there is a dissent, for example, if it is a 5-judge bench and the judgment is 3:2, then that can be again appealed in the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court allows or accepts that appeal, then it will be referred to a higher bench consisting of probably 7 or 9 or whatever judges the Supreme Court deems fit. Now another thing, who fixes the roster? Roster means who gets what case and what type of bench will be formed, who will be the judge. It is the Chief Justice of India who fixes the roster. So this is all about the Maratha quota, and also I've given you a brief background about the quota. So that is all for this video, friends. I hope this was helpful. Please connect with us on our Instagram page, UPSC for Everyone. You can also drop in your suggestions in the comment section. If you like our work, please subscribe to our channel and let us know how we're doing. See you next time. Till then, stay happy, stay safe, and have a great day. Namaste, Jai Hind.